Welcome once again to the Do Whatever podcast. What are you up to? Well, I'll tell you what I'm up to. I have been thinking a lot about combat. Of all things, right? My soft, smushy, squishy suburban life, thinking about combat. As I mentioned on the last episode, I have been training formally in Muay Thai kickboxing now. And that certainly tickles an urge, I guess. I don't know if that's the right way to put it, but that certainly kind of hits the bullseye of a psychological and physical urge to train and to struggle. And I really started thinking about that a lot more, why I'm attracted to that, why that's something beyond the obvious, just, the physical benefits and the fun part of it, and learning, something that can be used for self-defense, but something that's just fun overall, good stress release. What is attractive about that? And what it got me thinking back to is my days as a fencer. So probably the sport before Highland Games that I achieved the most in, spent the most time in, when you put a number of years together, far and away, was the sport of fencing. I could fence with all three weapons, and I'll get more into that, but I could, I really specialized in one called the épée, and I reached a decently high level doing that. I won a conference championship doing it, so it really got me sort of trying to connect the dots and see what was it that was so attractive about this stuff. So what I want to do on today's podcast is I kind of want to go down that rabbit hole a little bit, as we tend to do here. And I want to see both the things that I've created, I've written, I've thought about, the collected media that I have, and the thoughts of people that are a lot smarter than me, because that's always the way to go. And let's go on that journey and let's find out what it is that would cause a man in my situation, with my comfortable life, to seek out things that simulate or bring me close to the feeling of combat.
Give up now, leave me be. It's the crime of the century. And if you give up what you know.
There was a piece I wrote for a now failed blog. It was one of my first paid writing gigs, actually. I think this was back in 2008. Not a lot of pay, as you can imagine, but it was for kind of a burgeoning blog network. And they really just wanted things on random topics, sort of, maybe a proto do whatever idea like I'm doing here. But mostly it was trying to find things that people would think were, to use the words of the person that created it at the time, awesome. The person behind it actually was Ian Spector, who I believe he was the author of the Chuck Norris books. I don't know if he was the genesis of the Chuck Norris memes, but he was the first one that put it into a hardcover book or a hard copy book. So that was his kind of claim to fame, and this was one of his side projects, and it eventually kind of petered out, as a lot of blog projects do. But this was a piece that I wrote for it, and I called it Swords and Scars. And this was one of those, again, rabbit holes that I went down as I was still pursuing fencing at the time. I was on the tail end of my career in fencing. As I've often put it, that I was pushing 30 at the time. And the people that were beating me at tournaments were 14 years old. And I felt like without access, I didn't start to my 20s, and without access to the kind of coaching and the time and the dedication that these kids had, that me continuing to chase the Olympic dream was probably not going to be realistic. And it's one of those times you kind of have to take a serious snapshot of yourself, your abilities, your future, and know where you're headed. I mean, and I was also just in a place where I didn't have the passion for it anymore, and it wasn't something that, pervaded my thoughts at all times. So, but this was towards the tail end of it, and this was kind of an obvious choice for me. So, Swords and Scars. I'll read you some excerpts from it. Have you ever just wanted to fit in? Well, sure you have. At some point in your life, maybe even presently, you've thought about what lengths you would go to just feel like you belong. Throughout our youth, we subject ourselves to a mind-boggling series of dares, social maneuvers, oaths, lies, and outright humiliations in order to be respected, admired, and accepted. Failure to break into a clique can often have disastrous consequences. In American culture, such failure can lead to Melvins, atomic wedgies, swirlies, being imprisoned in a locker. Heck, you might even get punched. If you're a German college student, however, all you need to do is wear a funny costume, stand completely still, and try to get your face slashed open by one of your fellow students. There is a little-known, surprisingly gruesome tradition in German fraternities known as Minzer. As an aside, Minzer is kind of a shortening of the style duel called Minzeren, which is based around the word of measure. They measure distance from one another based on the length of a sword. Minzer is a centuries-old form of academic fencing that resembles a traditional duel in some ways, but for the most part is considered a chance for their participants to build character, prove their strength, mental fortitude, as well as their dedication to their fraternity. Or, here's me butchering a German word, Studentenverbindung. Studentenverbindung. That's a classic German word where they smash together a bunch all together. As a matter of perspective, so in American frats, we have beer bongs and games of soggy biscuit. In German frats, they slash at each other's faces with swords. And yes, in case you're wondering, the swords are sharp. The sword, or Schlager, for those of you that are fans of Goldschlager, maybe you can start figuring out the name, is a heavy steel weapon. It's only slightly modified from a dueling saber. So armed with these, participants suit up in leather and chainmail armor that covers everything but their face and head. To protect the eyes, steel-rimmed glasses are worn. Now, they look like a hybrid catcher's mitt and a robot. Now the two men, since women are verboten, stand 1 meter apart, the length of the blade as we talked about a minute ago, and proceed to slash at each other's face until they have either A, finished the requisite 40 courses that consist of 5 rounds, 4 blows struck by each man, or B, one of them is wounded sufficiently to warrant stoppage. Now I want to move away from the reading there to talk about the wounding, and I'll talk in a little more detail about it. But the wounding is pretty significant. They're wearing protective gear. They have goggles around the eyes. There's protection of the arms and the vital organs, but some of these wounds can get pretty serious. So going back, we'll travel back to that. I just don't want the idea to be that this is some sort of game where they're just trying to touch one another, which is what we've become used to with a lot of modern fencing also. So while having the trappings of a duel, it's important to remember that Minzer was in no way deadly combat. The ultimate goal was to build character. An extra awesome souvenir for any participant is a facial scar, or a schmies. These are highly prized, and being cut is not considered a defeat. Far from it. It's up until the early 20th century, these scars were considered the ultimate display of machismo for German men. So think of all those stereotypical Nazi villains with the big, ugly facial scars that you saw in movies. In fact, in this whole thing, there really are no winners or losers. Now, some of these things are based in sometimes there is an offense or created offense, as we know. Young men, college-age men, can find reasons to be offended or find reasons to have their honor insulted. But a lot of these things are really for show. Everybody wants to end up, once they're in the club, so to speak, they want to end up on the floor. They want to end up with a sword in their hand. They want to get there. So some of these offenses, while they may be real sometimes, some of these are also a little bit invented. But the idea is that there really are no winners or losers. The only way you can lose is to give a bad account of yourself. So each man is judged on his steadfastness, his courage, his ability to attack and parry correctly. Now, playing defense too much is frowned upon. But there's no need to worry. Be aggressive, right? There is a doctor on hand to suture all the wounds using no anesthetic whatsoever. So this isn't some strange historical oddity either, I want to point that out. This started around the 18th century and continues to this day. So year in, year out in Germany, men with relatively comfortable, civilized lives are willingly subjecting themselves to the razor-sharp blades of their buddies. They're signing up for it. There's evidence, I guess, or hearsay that at the upper echelons of German industry and corporations, that it's almost like what fratty when they almost quietly require a fencing background of men at that level. So who knows? It's not beyond the realm of imagination to say that there's still a boys' club in this world, and this boys' club might involve facial scars and swords. So think about that. Think about the culture, forgoing all the obvious patriarchal problems with saying that only, you can only get into this level of corporate power by being in a men's only fencing club, which also brings into question if this is really the case anymore. But if it is, think about that. Think about how the positives of that. Think about the kind of people that you're probably going to end up with, that you're going to end up as candidates for those high-level leadership positions. Two things. You're probably going to end up with people that are unafraid of adversity, people that are not afraid to stand in the face of a problem, literally and figuratively. But you might also end up with some sociopaths, which unfortunately, we've also seen that being a sociopath may not be the worst thing in the path to corporate success. So you might end up with some very successful people with that particular model of selection, if that's really the case anymore. But again, these are also people that are unafraid to take some damage to achieve a goal or to stand in the face of danger to do it. Mark Twain wrote about this. Mark Twain actually witnessed Mensurin, the student dueling. And he wrote, "The student is glad to get wounds in the face because the scars they leave will show so well there. And it's also said that these face wounds are so prized that youths have been even known to pull them apart from time to time and pour red wine in them to make them heal badly and leave as ugly a scar as possible. I had seen the heads and faces of 10 youths gashed in every direction by the keen two-edged blades, and yet had not seen a victim wince, nor heard a moan, or detected any fleeting expression which confessed the sharp pains the hurts were inflicting." God, how good is Mark Twain? So these things, again, these cuts are a prize. And it's interesting to me because the wounds, I think we have a little more culture of a vanity, a more vanity-based culture now where, a facial scar, people might be a little more reticent to get that. Regardless of what I think most people's general sensibilities show you, that most people don't mind facial scars, but we still have a idea that we don't want to get slashed in the face. And I think that's, overall pretty healthy. But this idea, what those scars mean to them, it's not just it looks cool. I think there is a certain amount of that. Like it makes you look like somebody not to be trifled with, looks like somebody who's actually experienced some stuff. I think that's what scars do for you in general. But the meaning of those scars, how I got these, that's what they, and not even just externally, not that you get to tell a cool story because they might not even do that, but what it carries internally to know what you had to stand in front of to receive that scar. And to know that. And then to be part of a culture that may recognize what you went through to get those scars is very cool. Now, I mentioned in my piece that I was reading an excerpt from there that, don't worry, there's a doctor on hand to suture all the wounds. And that seems all well and good, right? That seems, yeah, okay, I've got a medical professional in place. Oh, we got a dog that wants out of the office here. I'm going to let him out real quick. Go ahead, buddy. Go ahead. You're good. He's old. That's my oldest doggy. He's going to be 14 this year. Moving slow. His hips hurt. I can relate. But yeah, the medical professional, so to speak. Most times these are medical students. So I'm going to read an excerpt from a book called By the Sword by Richard Cohen. Richard Cohen was a British champion fencer, and he wrote what is really the Bible for people that are into bladed combat, sword combat, especially from a Western, a European perspective. He does talk about Japanese swordplay in there quite a bit, but Western fencing has always been kind of my jam, so to speak. So he says, the second act of the spectacle took place in the dressing room. The doctors, in evidence, were generally medical students, coarse-looking men who seemed rather to relish their work. I like that part. And who carried out their repairs without much regard to the pain or physiognomy of their charges. So basically saying they don't care if it's uncomfortable or if you're going to look gross when I'm done with you. This is all part of the ritual, since how the student bears the dressing of his wounds is as important as how he receives them. Every operation has to be performed as brutally as may be, and his companions watch him during the process to see that he goes through it with an appearance of peace and enjoyment. A clean-cut wound that gapes wide is most desired by all parties. On purpose, it is sewn up clumsily with the hope that by this means the scar will last a lifetime. And these scars, again, what you have to consider here is that these were real swords. This is real steel. This is sharp, triangular blades cutting into skin. And there was this idea that the best kind of most desired cut was the one that went, as the students would say, that would go through the two skins. that would, and dermis and epidermis, let's say, that we're getting down to muscle tissue. We're getting down to the gross stuff. That's what they desired. The most highly prized thing you could do to another person was to hack the end of their nose off, and then have to have them reattach that or not. So this is a level of controlled brutality that I think that we're not in touch with a lot of times. At least I'm not in my culture. But we need to subject ourselves to those kind of things. We need to subject ourselves to some kind of pain and suffering. And that's what these guys are doing. It builds character and it puts it on display. I want to repeat that. It builds character and it puts it on display without braggadocio, without excessive ego. It puts your confidence and the character you've built in confrontation on display. Now, this is one end of a spectrum of creating hardship, of creating danger, of creating character building situations, much like weight training, much like sports. I was just listening to my business partner and friend, Matt Vincent, talk to powerlifter Ed Cohen. And Matt is fond of saying this, and it's true. And what he was talking about with Ed was that those kind of things, sports, weightlifting, all these different things, we have such easy lives that we don't have to hunt and kill and farm and gather, that we almost create these sorts of adversity for ourselves. And that says a lot about the human condition, and if I can be so bold as to say, what it is to be a man in modern society. Where do we find our tests now? For me personally, as I mentioned earlier, I was a younger man, a college-aged man, and I think that's a time, especially in America, where I think a lot of young men want to start testing themselves. And I guess I can draw a parallel there to the German students, slashing at each other. But I think my pursuits were, of course, more tame, but not unrelated. I think they share a common thread, a common genesis. So when I started college, I had come through a lifetime of kind of, suburban sports and high school baseball, kind of had played at being an athlete and just kind of kept it as a habit, more or less. It wasn't, I don't think there was ever going to be any future for me. But, that urge to compete, that drive never really went away. And I think that age of college, that era, you're kind of developing into a more mature version of yourself. You're kind of tasting independence and adulthood for the first time. So you mix that in with the normal urge to compete and be physical. And I think you're going to find some outlets. And I think it's healthy that you find some outlets. And I remember going through a phase when I had been in college for, I think, an entire year, that I started realizing that, hey, they have physical education classes. They have all these different things available to you. And I started looking down the list. And I remember the three things that I looked at, and this is funny now given my current proclivities, is the three things that I looked at as they had Taekwondo, and they also had Taekwondo and Judo. Then they had fencing and they had archery. And I told myself I was going to do at least those three, but I was going to try to find a way every semester to do a physical education course along with my normal course load. And the first one I did was Taekwondo. And I had dabbled again, like I said, in martial arts growing up. I had boxed and done martial arts with my brother, my family, all throughout my youth. And it was just always something that I dabbled in, something that I did. And, my family had this idea that you should at least be able to defend yourself, handle yourself. We had some boxers in the family, and that kind of got passed down, so on and so forth. So I thought, oh, this would be a fun, new, and different way for me to do a take on that. So I did a semester of Taekwondo, earned my yellow belt. So watch out, y'all. But after that, I figured maybe I could go for that another semester. Maybe I could do Judo. My girlfriend at the time, who's now my wife, she did the Judo class, and she actually got some good stuff out of that. I think I went to it with her one time, got thrown around. But the next semester, I decided to try fencing, and that had always been one that really piqued my curiosity, that I thought really, in some way, maybe, again, tickled at that urge for competition or for, It's strange to say danger when you're talking about fencing, but I don't know, adding a weapon into the mix adds a different dynamic, I guess is the best way to say it. It puts a different angle on things. And so I just wanted to try it. I think for a lot of the same romanticized reasons a lot of people get into fencing. I was never one of the... there's a group called the SCA, the Society for Creative Anachronism, and this is a group that does, historical fencing, kind of medieval reenactment kind of stuff. They've kind of given way to something called HEMA now, which is I think it's historical European martial arts, which is a little bit more based around European martial arts, swordplay, things like that, which is very cool stuff. And that wasn't really around in the days where I started fencing, but I never really was one of those people. I wasn't. I hesitate to say this, but people that get into fencing are usually kind of one of two types. You have people who have grown into that sport or have an athletic background or are looking to do it competitively, and then you have the role-playing crowd. And I know it's a broad sweeping generalization, and I'm not saying that I've never played a role-playing game in my life, because I certainly have, but there's a lot of people that are just there because they like the idea of swordplay in real life, of somehow bridging the gap between reality and whatever games they may be playing, whatever role-playing things they may be into. But I came at it more as an athlete. I thought it would be a good outlet and a good use of my particular talents, my body type. I thought I might have an edge in the fact that, I had played some sports and I had lifted weights. And sure enough, I did. I started that first semester... second semester of physical education, went into fencing, and this is true Olympic fencing. This is, the stuff you see in the Olympics with wearing all white, the mask, it looked like beekeeper's mask, and the whippy swords. And I fell in love, and I didn't do any other kind of physical education for the rest of the time I was in college. For the additional 3 years of college, I did nothing else. I fell hard for it. I loved the environment. I loved the competitiveness. I loved the technicality. I love the occasional brutality. And I know it doesn't look like that from the outside in. I understand, but I like the occasional brutality. And I liked the ability to rise in the ranks, that you could actually compete and make something of yourself. And there was a bigger stage for this, the Olympics. I enjoyed that part of it quite a bit. I like the camaraderie of the people that I fenced with, the team that I fenced with. I eventually went from just doing it as a physical education class to competing for the University of Texas. And in those 3 years, I developed quite a bit. I kind of found a specialization to kind of delve into that a little bit. In Olympic fencing, there are 3 weapons. There are 3 disciplines. So it's not always the same weapon you're seeing when you're seeing it at the Olympics. And if you see those highlights and flashes. The first weapon that everybody learns is called the foil. The foil is a small weapon. All these weapons are very small. They weigh less than a pound. And it's a smaller weapon that's a point weapon, meaning you have to depress a button on the point to to complete a circuit, set an electrical switch off, make a light go off. And the target area is the torso. No legs, no arms, no head. So that's that's kind of the first weapon of classical structured academy style fencing. And then from there, you expand into, you have saber, which is a weapon that doesn't have a button on the end, but the entire weapon is electrified. And anything above the waist is the target. And that's a slashing weapon, and that's fast-paced. And that is one that the United States, because of a particular fencer named Mariel Zagunis, that we have won a couple of gold medals in the past decade. She's a fantastic saber fencer, and that's kind of the U.S.'s weapon. That's in this era. That's kind of been where we've had the most successful fencers. And then the third weapon was my weapon, the épée. Now, épée is French, basically French for sword or dueling sword. That's a French word for sword. And the épée is a heavier weapon with a larger handguard, thicker blade. It's still a point weapon. It's not a slashing weapon, so you have to depress the button on the end. But the entire body, from the bottom of the feet to the top of the head, everything is a target area. You can hit anything. Nothing's off limits. It's slower paced because you have that danger of the button going off anywhere. There's a lot of hits on the hands and arm because it's the closest possible thing on that person to you when they're holding a weapon out. So I've kind of found a home in that weapon, and I ended up winning a conference championship with that weapon. And it really kind of, it lit the fire in me, and it really kind of satisfied that urge for competition and for rising in the ranks and for recognition, to be perfectly honest, because people recognized that I had a talent and an ability for this. And that certainly fueled my ego quite a bit. And again, we can kind of bridge into, how I continued to kind of chase that dream of the Olympics for, nearly a decade. And like I said earlier, that ended in a petering out process. But I think what's so interesting is that I found that as a way to test myself. That I started with Taekwondo, considered judo a way to test myself, but I found this was my particular way to test myself. And it's very interesting to me that, like I said, that was the particular avenue I found, because as I got more and more into this sport, I found that this is nothing new. This idea of young men with swords is nothing new, just like we talked about, just like those German students. But all throughout history, especially focusing on, Western culture, European culture, the idea of young men carrying swords, of duels of honor, of, people at the drop of a hat, often, drawing swords and having agreements to have duels. And this is a long-standing thing, is men putting each other in mortal danger to test themselves and to defend supposed honor, which I think in the era that fencing that dueling came into its own, I think we can probably surmise that a lot of honor really was just a pretense. A lot of these things, honor duels, were things of pretense, but a lot of this, duels didn't just, most of the time in the modern era, the era of fencing and true duels, they didn't happen just, as the offense happened and people drew swords right there in the street and dueled. These were formal affairs. These were organized. There were challenges, sometimes often done in writing, sent back and forth, acceptances, organizations, time, places, weapons chosen, seconds chosen. A second is a person who is there to make sure that you and the other person follow the rules that are established of the duel. There's a judge, there are doctors. So this is more akin to an amateur sporting event than it is to just a fight. And I think that's an interesting distinction. Like I said, because I didn't just, to test myself, I didn't go out in the street and start fights. I didn't go out to 6th Street here in Austin and just, pick fights in bars. I'm not saying there aren't people that do that. Check YouTube. There's plenty of people doing that. But I found a kind of structured way, an academic way to test myself. And let's be honest, it's a relatively safe way. And that kind of brings me to my next point. My next point of discussion here is, why is it so safe? Why is sword fighting so safe now? Besides the obvious that people probably don't want to get hurt and maimed for doing these things to test their manhood, their sportsmanship, their ability, whatever you want to call it. Besides that, why has it become so safe? Why is Olympic fencing so easy to make fun of? Why is watching it now, it looks really nothing like what you see in the movies? Why does that happen? There's a lot of great writing on this. There's a lot of great content about this out there, about how this happened, how this progression happened. And that book that I mentioned earlier by Richard Cohen has a great section, an entire section of the book, several chapters on that kind of progression, how that happened. I mean, the long and short of it is that the sword is just kind of how a lot of people view, like people in rural areas view guns, that they are a tool. They were less of a weapon for, a threatening weapon for day-to-day use than they were a tool. For a long time, as we grew into an agricultural people across different parts of the world, the sword was really more of a tool, a military tool. Let's say a tool for defense, not something to defend your honor with. And these were military weapons. And military for a long time was very much hack and slash. It was people that, before the advent of metal armor, these are people wearing cloth, leather, hides, all those sort of things. And there's a lot of hack and slash. I mean, look at the, what is the Roman sword called? It's called a gladius. It looks like an overblown knife. That's a hacking implement. Of course, you can thrust with it, but that's built for hacking. And a lot of weapons were that way. Also because they had to be built so thick that they could not bend while being used. So they came, they had more heft to them. They were for hacking. And that continued for thousands of years. Well, not thousands. Yeah, thousands of years. Until the advent of metal armor sort of changed the game, is that all of a sudden hacking metals, iron against other metals or steel against steel. As things progressed, it became pointless. Even against chainmail, a slashing weapon doesn't really do that much. So the solution became smaller pointed weapons that could find weak points in armor, that could find weak points in whatever somebody was wearing to protect themselves. And so a lot of times this first part of this progression was you have your hacking sword, your big wobbly bending metal sword, to be perfectly honest. But you also, and there are tales, there are stories of people like Celtic warriors using blades of different alloys and metals, and that in the middle of battle they have to kind of retire from the battle and straighten their weapons back out. That the metals were that soft. But you would have your hacking slashing weapon, but you'd also have a dagger or a small sword, as they came to be called. You'd have something that was small enough and pointed enough that you were attacking with the point into places in the armor where you could actually penetrate. So that changed the game in terms of what everybody wanted to have on them for a sword. And it sort of neutralized the idea of carrying around a big weapon. And also what happened is that the Italians and the Spanish were responsible for a style of fencing that used a longer weapon, the rapier, which could cut but could also use the point, and that the style of fencing was more forward. The style of sword fighting was more forward, and it used the point a lot more, and it created this idea that you could do the most damage by piercing and keeping a person at distance from you, instead of getting inside and having to hack and slash and risk yourself. That the best tactic was to stay at arm's length, at weapon's length, keep your body back, make yourself a smaller target by turning to the side instead of standing face on to somebody. So that was the beginning of that evolution. And then the French took that evolution, and turned it into a revolution. Hey, let's stick with the rhyme scheme there. The French, they had a knack for kind of codifying things, for making things for documenting them, for making progressions. This happened in ballet. This happened in art. This happened in fencing for sure. And the other part alongside it becoming an academic pursuit, fencing, it became a pursuit of nobility. It became kind of an expectation that any man worth his salt is going to know how to handle a sword. And along with that progression, you started to see weapons get smaller and smaller. Now the rapier, the weapon I was talking about earlier, was a big weapon. Italian fencing weapons were bigger. They were longer. But rapiers were, they were over 3 feet, sometimes 4 to 5 feet, apocryphally, and they were very, very long weapons. And it became, and the European weapons, Northern Europeans and Central European weapons often were like a broader Claymore-style weapon. The Claymore is not what you think it is a lot of times, like the big Braveheart-style weapon. A Claymore is just a thicker kind of one-handed sword, usually with a basket hilt, a thing to protect your hand. But the fashion became more and more that for what were called town swords. And a town sword was something you could wear that wouldn't be overly audacious and wouldn't get in your way and wouldn't look as threatening when you wore it. It was probably about 3 feet long, a little smaller, looked a little more akin to the modern épée, the weapon that I fenced with, the electrical version of that. And it looks very similar to it, to be perfectly honest. There's not a lot of difference, except that the one I used wasn't sharp and it had an electrical wire on it. But, that became the fashion, was to wear the town sword. And that kind of became insultingly called the small sword. Over time, because it's small, so you're trying to insult somebody's sword size, right? That's really what it all comes down to, is comparing sword sizes when we're talking about these tests of honor and manhood, right? So the small sword was again a revolution in that it was more maneuverable, it was fast, it reduced the size of the handguard, the weight overall, and it really became much more about finesse, point control, the point of the weapon, and defense, and your ability to move in and out. Your ability to separate offense from defense and be able to parry, which is to take the other person's attack offline, and riposte, which is to answer with your own attack. And so that became the style of dueling. That's really how people fought. That's how they drew blood. That's how duels of honor were handled. It looked a lot like the modern fencing that you see, where it was people standing, standing obliquely or to sideways almost, with toes, front toe pointing forward, weapon pointing forward, the rest of the body behind. Kind of profile facing almost, and it became that style of like dashing in and out, and the whole body is the target when you're dueling unless otherwise agreed on. So you can duel to blood, you can duel to death, you can duel to submission, whatever you want. There can be, you can, whenever you challenge somebody, you make up your own rules, right? Whatever's hot to do at the time. But fencing really did look like that for a while. And then over time, people want to get better at this. So that's where the French get really good at making, at creating a codified and an academic system of fencing. And this is where schools arise. This is where the profession of fencing arises. This is where, royal funding of fencing schools and creating fencing programs and being the best in Europe at fencing, becomes, then you develop the German system, the Eastern European system, the German and French systems, the even English fencing is its own thing like that. It becomes, and of course you have the Italians and the Spanish with their particular styles, the Spanish doesn't change that much, just gets more complicated, but that could be an entire podcast right there. So with this French model of things becoming academic, it becoming a sport, what you get is you have to find a way to practice. And practicing with sharp swords only goes so far. And there was plenty of time where that was the case. It was just an idea that I'm going to use a slightly blunted or not my sharpest weapon, and we're going to exhibit control, much like sparring now. Like in the class that I'm taking right now, the Muay Thai class I'm taking, the sparring, we go without headgear, but it's understood that you're going to go at 30% speed and intensity. And that's an agreement, but that's all well and good when it's punches and kicks. But when it's a bladed weapon or a pointed weapon, it doesn't take many slip-ups to end up with a lot of unwanted facial scars, as opposed to the ones we talked about earlier, or unwanted lost eyes. So you start developing safety mechanisms. You start developing things like masks. You start developing buttons on the end of the weapon. Okay, you have a button on the end of the weapon anymore, and so you have a button on the end of the weapon. So how can you tell who's scoring when if there's no ouchie to it? How do you tell? We have to create a system of rules then for practice. And what the system of rules that was created by the French for the foil, which was the practice small sword, was the right of way. And this is where everybody gets lost on fencing. So everything I've been saying about how fencing evolves to where it's hard to watch now has a lot to do with this, the right of way system. The right of way system basically creates a rule set about who can attack in a valid way and when. So the easiest way I can try to explain it is that if we're both fencing, we're both attacking each other. I'm trying to hit you in the chest, you're trying to hit me in the chest with a foil, let's say. If I attack you first, if I start attacking, I have taken the right of way, I have it. If my attack lands, I get the point. Very plain and simple. However, if that attack fails, or you parry that attack, you now have the right of way. You've taken the right of way from me, and your counterattack or your riposte, your answer to me, will be valid, and you'll have the right of way. So that's the easiest exchange to understand right of way. And although that's convoluted and hard to watch, and it also leaves some subjectivity up to the judge, the director watching, it's the only way that they could really create a system of how to fence correctly without having mortal danger or without having physical danger. So to remove physical danger to practice, you have to create that system. You have to create safety mechanisms, and you have to create that system to really teach the system of fencing that the French wanted. Let's put it more over that way, because that leads into why I liked the épée so much, why I chose that particular weapon. That weapon does not have right of way. The épée is the closest to what a real duel would look like that you're going to get in modern fencing. And that's disappointing in some ways to some people, I understand, because the weapons still look like pieces of wire. They're wearing all white and they're wearing masks and nobody bleeds. But just because of the implication and the stakes in a competitive environment of wanting to touch without being touched, it creates that sort of interaction. Now, is there more risk taking than there would be with sharp weapons? Absolutely. I mean, I've been stabbed fatally thousands of times with weapons that are completely safe because I was trying to take chances and win a sport. And that's something you cannot escape unless there's bloodshed. Yeah, interestingly, some who believe is the greatest fencer that ever lived, Aldo Nadi, was an Italian fencer, and he was involved. He was an Olympian. He was an Italian champion, one of the greatest ever, and he was a showman too. He's a great advocate for fencing, and he was alive in the early 20th century. And he had a duel there were actual images taken of it, and I should have this ready. I'm just thinking of it now, so I'm going off of memory. So I apologize to anybody who's a true historian here. But he had been, someone in the press had criticized him, and he had responded, and the man in the press, being a fencer himself, challenged him to an honor duel, and he accepted it. So, but the interesting thing about there being a photograph is that Aldo Nati was known to have incredible technique. His footwork was pristine and perfect competitively, and that's what made him hard to beat. And one of the things you don't want to do when you lunge at someone and you attack in classical fencing or in Olympic fencing is that you don't want your back foot to come off the ground, because that means you fully committed your weight to the front foot and you're unable to move back out of distance, or you're unable to parry candle attacks or renew your attack as best you can. That's something you have to beat out of newbies, because they want to kind of overcommit and get above the other person's weapon and try to, it's sort of a stop mechanism. Like you do this because you kind of commit to an attack, but you realize the other person's blade is there, so you stop short because you haven't really handled the blade. So you're overcommitting, but you're realizing the error of your way, is most times what that happens, that you see that there's a blade there and you have to do something about it. So you raise that back foot to kind of change your momentum or try to stop it fast. But it completely leaves you vulnerable if you do that in Olympic fencing. Well, the great thing about the image that you got of Aldo Nati was, in one of his lunges, they captured his back foot clearly all the way off the ground. I mean, like he was kicking behind, there was like a donkey kick behind him. And he would never do that, but the stakes were real. There was a razor sharp, needle pointed weapon pointed at him by his opponent, who he was clearly the superior fencer to in most estimations. But that just goes to show you that the game changes when real danger is on the line. So all that to say, that's what attracted me to the epee as a weapon. And I could never really understand why people weren't more attracted to that weapon. I mean, there's plenty of people that are, but I never understood why, when that was on the table, people would choose foil or saber, these right-of-way weapons that had convoluted rules and restricted target areas. But as I get older, I understand it, because not everybody's in it for the same reasons. Not everybody wants the same kind of challenge. And the speed and accuracy involved in those weapons is also incredibly attractive. And to be honest, saber fencing looks a little bit cooler. There's a lot more slash, a lot more flashing of the blades, a lot more fast footwork, stomping, and loud celebrations and big personalities. And you'll find there's personalities attracted across the three weapons. I could do another entire podcast on just that. So it was a way of getting that sort of tingle of combat with none of the real risk. And I don't see there's anything particularly wrong with that. But I think where the translation, where we get a loss of ability to translate this to a bigger audience, is that safety aspect does not translate to spectators very well. The fact that, they don't feel the tingle of, that danger or the competitive fire. They don't get to feel that along with you. And that's why I don't think, outside of Europe, where this is steeply ingrained in cultures, that you're going to see fencing ever take hold. And that's fine. There's plenty of great sports, fringe sports, that are never going to hit the mainstream, and it's fine. They don't have to. Not every sport has to be baseball or football. Not every sport has to find a mega following, an international following. It doesn't have to happen. But, I always think that when people in the fencing world, when I used to be really into it, they would think about ways to make it more viewer friendly, and like things like adding lights to the masks and letting us see the fencers' faces more. Like, they're all great ideas, but you just have to understand that when you take the danger element and the bloodshed element out of sword combat, of bladed combat, you're never going to get the kind of viewership that you would get in the Colosseum, let's say. There's an innate tying of those two things together, I think, in the human mind and the human psyche, that combat should lead to danger. Now, other sports do this pretty well. I think you could point to American football being a great example of something that manages to balance a reasonable amount of violence and risk with strategic play and team play to make it interesting. The NFL has done, if they've done nothing else, has created a very intriguing strategic game that people will watch for 3 hours. And that's really, there's a lot to be said for that. I think the sport that does it best, and of course I'm probably biased because this is really the sport that I watch the most, is mixed martial arts. I believe mixed martial arts has really filled the gap for, you know, our lust for the gladiatorial, for blood sport, for bloodshed. It's filled that gap. And other martial arts, other combat sports, let's say, have done so in the past. I think boxing captured Western imagination for quite a long time because of the visceral nature of it. But I think mixed martial arts took that to the next level by removing rules and barriers, which is something that you cannot do with swordplay unless you are ready for people to be wounded and or die, as they used to. And fortunately for all of us, death by honor duel or death by raiding tribes or death by, you know, a neighboring city-state is not really a risk that we run anymore. It's not something that we have to deal with. There are people in the world that do. I don't want to say that, I don't want to try to be categorical for all humanity there, but where I live, and in Western culture for the most part, we don't live in risk of those things. So fortunately for us, but I guess unfortunately for the entertainment value, we could say, is that there's not a very good chance of you seeing an honor duel in the streets anytime soon, or being part of one and living through it and having a tale to tell. So we have to find those things vicariously. And unfortunately, bladed combat, fencing, is going to continue to go the way of an historical artifact, of something that we are not going to, hopefully, move back towards as a species. We're not going to move back towards, you know, bladed combat in the streets, honor duels over, you know, pretend ideas of chivalry and, you know, being gentlemanly. Those, we're probably not going to move that direction. You could blame some of that on just becoming more civilized, being safer. You could also blame a lot of that on firearms and better policing. Let's be totally honest about it. And the firearms change a lot of things. It's not as necessary for a man to anymore. And then I'm only saying man because historically this has been the case. We're the only ones dumb and testosterone fueled enough to carry around weapons in the hopes that we get to use them. But it's no longer a test of a man's worth or how prepared he is to defend what's his or defend his honor, whatever it may be. It's just not a part of who we are anymore. But we have found other ways to fill that void. But hey, at least I can hold on to this. If civilization goes south, everything gets turned upside down, all the computers, all the lights shut off, and everybody runs out of ammo eventually, I got a pretty good chance of winning a sword fight. The Do Whatever podcast is brought to you by Hate Brand Goods. Hate Brand Goods is an apparel company for people that like adventure, embrace adversity, and are committed to the pursuit of awesome. Hate is a personal philosophy of self-improvement through self-loathing. It's using your negative energy to get a positive result. It's not even the mean way of spelling hate. It's H-B-I-I-I. It's clever, right? It's not just a normal hate. So head over to thehate.com. Again, that's the HVIII.com. And use code DOWHATEVER, all one word, at checkout. You get 20% off your order. Hate Brand Goods got clothes. Hate Brand Goods got hats. Hate Brand Goods got coffee. They got a lot of stuff. So head over, use Do Whatever at checkout, 20% off your order. Do Whatever is also brought to you by Throw Bros. Throw Bros is the only online store built just for throwing athletes. Everything you need to stock up for the season. Tape, chalk, tacky, hammer blade. Those last two things, you don't even know what those are unless you're a thrower. So you can find them at Throw Bros. There's even a dedicated section for ebooks, resources specifically for throwers, for Highland Games throwers. And the library is still growing. It's growing all the time. So head over to throwbros.com and use the code DOWHATEVER, again, all one word, DOWHATEVER, for 20% off your entire order. Throw Bros, gear up, get throwing. All right, that brings us to a conclusion here. Thank you very much for listening. Thanks for coming along for the journey here. I can't wait to show you some of the rabbit holes that I have found. And the best part is that I've been talking to a lot of very cool friends, a lot of very cool people who do some very interesting things, professionally and otherwise. And I'm going to get them to talk about what they're into. I'm going to get them to talk about what their current side obsessions are, what the things that's got their attention besides their main thing. That's what I'm really into. I like to talk to people. I like to get to know about their primary hustle, if you will, but I like to know what the thing is that's grabbing all their attention. I like to know what they stay up late watching YouTube videos about. What weird books are they reading? What Wikipedia page has launched them into days-long obsessions with strange things, or not even strange things, just things outside of their normal sphere that you'd expect. So look for those episodes coming soon. Thanks again for listening, and I will talk to you guys soon.
And if you leave me, that's okay. I need you now, but I can't pretend anyway. I wanna hide, so give me your love.